Hello, welcome to Meaning of Life TV. It's been a few months since I've been on Bill Black, talking today to Erin Bartram. We're both historians. I give a little bit of update on what's happened with me. Since last time I was on Meaning of Life for Blogging Heads, I've finished my PhD at Rice and am now a visiting instructor at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, which is about an hour north of Nashville. Anyone knows where that is. Erin, could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I am a historian and writer. I finished a PhD at the University of Connecticut in 2015 with a specialty in U.S. history, women, gender, and religion. I then was a visiting assistant professor for 3 years at the University of Hartford, and I'm currently an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut, Stamford. I co-edit a series for University Press Kansas called Rethinking Academia, Rethinking Careers. Do a number of other things related to not just history, but higher education. And I know you from a lot of things. Yes, I should say we have met before. We are friends. So this will be a fun experience. Though I guess our sort of first topic is a bit controversial. This op-ed that came out, when it came out in November 1st, called "Academia is a Cult" by a writer I'm not familiar with, Andrew Marsoni. Came out in the Washington Post. What would you say was the sort of gist of this for someone who hasn't read it? I think, and I should obviously preface this by saying any notoriety I have among academia is because of a piece that I wrote, which went viral about leaving academia, so-called quit lit. So in a sense, your blog post that went, and you were interviewed by the Chronicle of Higher Education about it, and it's in a kind of vaguely the same genre as this piece, right? You may not feel comfortable being lumped in with it, but I could say an outsider. And it's all, I think it's all, it's interesting to think about which emotions are considered productive and which ones are not in the space of thinking about academia. But essentially this piece, I think, attempts to communicate to the quote-unquote outside world how messed up academia is, something I think would broadly agree with, by comparing it to a cult, which is the term that he uses. The author had grown up as a member of the Living World Fellowship, which he describes as widely recognized as a cult. And he sort of spins this extended metaphor about how in academia he thought he was in the place to essentially judge the world that he had grown up in and found himself in a system that seemed to be reproducing a lot of the problems.
It seems like he found academia as a path kind of out of a cult, right? Yeah. And then he found that it itself was a cult. Yeah. He talks about cults being systems of social control, insular. There's a lot of emphasis placed on loyalty to authority figures, that you're supposed to have what he calls unwavering commitment. And that he sort of says you see the same things in academia, that the cult leader is the advisor, and that the unwavering loyalty might manifest itself in terms of restrictions on what one writes for one's dissertation, or putting very expensive purchases on a grad student's maxed out credit card in service of the advisor. So this is sort of the larger metaphorical package I think he uses to try to communicate to people who might not understand what academia is like, why it's a problem. And it seems like I think it's partly inspired by everything that's been coming out about the Avital Ronell. I'm not sure to pronounce her last name. Yeah. Which people can check out recent Feminine Chaos episode where Phoebe Maltz-Bovey and Kat Rosenfield talk about this at length. We're not going to retread it, but
part of these sort of stories of things where it's not necessarily sexual harassment, which is probably what we kind of initially were hearing about, but kind of a broader based kind of abuse, manipulation of, people who are all desperate to get that job when they get out. Mm-hmm. I guess before we sort of, pick at it, what do you kind of ring truest about this?
I mean, I think that the conditions that he describes are often true. I think that people's experience with an individual charismatic leader, shall we say, I don't think that is in any way a universal, which I think kind of gets us to think about exactly how the metaphor is supposed to operate. Who is the charismatic leader? Is it the market? Is it academia? Or is it a given person? I and many people had no such charismatic leader as their advisor. That being said, it does seem to persist in lots of spaces. The willingness to do anything, or the implication that you should be willing to do anything because jobs are so rare and there's only so many ways to stand out, that does ring true. And I have actually myself talked about academia as a religion, which I actually think functions much better than calling it a cult. And there are reasons I have sort of a problem with the cult language as opposed to the ways of talking about religious metaphor. We're all looking for different paths to salvation and trying to figure out what's the right way to get there. But I think there are issues with the cult framing.
Well, I'll say I like that you said that, because I have found that there is this, religion around academia, and that those who sort of manage to come out of academia sort of healthy and sane, either just happen to do really well in that particular religion, or they're able to see that religion for what it is, not let it, define them. Mm-hmm. Because there is a sort of, like in many religions, there's like these steps where you finish the dissertation, and then you get the tenure track job, and then you write the first book, and then you get promotion, you get tenure, then you write your second book, and you become, a full professor, and then, you get a Festschrift written in your honor, and you die, and that is the romantic sort of career you're supposed to have, and that gives you meaning. And then your afterlife is in the few books that bear your name in a library, or you have the students that you mentored, and they mentor other students, and that's sort of your progeny. Why I was surprised just sort of how kind of cavalierly he used the word cult, as if it's like a kind of just a sort of scientific term.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And excuse me, I have a cold. I'm going to have to blow my nose. Sorry. It's Thanksgiving break, and it's when it all comes crashing down. As a person who studied the history of religion to some extent, it surprised me coming from someone who has a degree in English. I would think would know better than to use that term so blithely. It is not a term. It's certainly not a category of analysis for scholars of the history of religion, religious studies, and all of this. It may be a kind of category of practice for the people that we are looking at, but it's not actually a useful term. And I think here I'm thinking of I'm trying to think the work of Sean McLeod. I don't know if you've ever read like Making the American Religious Fringe. That the term cult is as much a word used to define what is normal religion and what is not, which is very much situated in particular cultural moments. And I think because
no one's like, oh yeah, I'm in a cult.
Yeah, and that when when it breaks down, there are even the things that he uses that describe a cult would describe what many American Christians would consider mainstream religion, which is why I think I struggle with his use of the term, because I think in using it to try to emphasize the extreme nature of this organization, it also is the term that is used to essentially make it an exotic or separate thing, that this is somehow out of the norm. And I think there's sort of two problems with that. One, there are many other fields in which you see many of the same behaviors. How many cults do there have to be within your society before it's not a cult, it's just your culture? That if we can talk about much of what we see in this academia thing, we see in the world of nonprofits, we see in Silicon Valley, we see in teaching, we see in all these other spaces, how much is the language of cult simply there to make it so that we don't have to think about how academia concentrates and replicates the problems of our economy and culture, and that maybe it sticks out there because it's supposed to be, or we imagine it to be outside of that economy and culture.
Yeah.
That, reading it, you could sub in several other things. And I think maybe we're drawn to that language simply because academia is supposed to be above all that. It's okay for, the tech community to operate like that. The one parallel I see all the time, and I don't think it's as used as a weapon as much in academia, but, if there's free food around, people will stay and work longer. And grad school is just full of, leftovers anyway.
Yeah.
So I think I would never use the term cult so blithely, and maybe it's because of his own personal history that he finds that term useful. But as a framework for analysis, I think it's problematic because it allows people to say, oh, that's so extreme, but also that's very separate from my life and my problems. And I don't think any of the problems that are in academia are inherently that different from outside of academia. They manifest differently.
It seems to be if you exoticize the problems of academia like you're talking about, it kind of feeds into this sort of reactionary story that academia is detached, that it's, so far out there that, I could see someone using a story like this to sort of just justify the continual defunding of higher education.
Well, and that it can, when you bring in the comparison of other workplaces and fields that function like this, it seems like it could be very easy to say, well, this is wrong in academia because the stuff they produce is stupid and useless, but it's okay for this to be in the tech world because that's important work that's being done. This is, this is a bad religion. So of course it's bad that people would be feel forced to do this kind of work, but this is a good religion. So it's okay if you have these same practices there because the product is good.
It does seem to me that these stories tend to be about like English or other kinds of humanities departments, when surely there are similar sort of abusive relationships develop in STEM fields, but that wouldn't be seen as a bad religion because they're producing something that's seen as quote unquote useful.
I think that's a really good point, and it's something that, you'd never know that there's the same jobs crisis in STEM from the way it gets talked about. With us, it's poorly paid adjuncts. With people in the humanities, it's poorly paid adjuncts. There's been plenty of writing on the crisis of perpetual postdocs in the science fields, but somehow that doesn't seem to register. And I've even in my work with this series for the press found a lot of people coming out of STEM fields not really, the term alt-act doesn't register, that a lot of these dialogues are not really on their radar. And I do wonder how much of it is that they're doing useful things, unlike the rest of us who were involved in a cult where very clearly the doctrines were false and the heaven wasn't there. But maybe it is for other people.
Yeah, like the stories about Avital kind of quickly ended up becoming about sort of, quoting the stuff that she had written and becoming just sort of mocking, post-structuralist theory or whatever it was she was doing. And
yep. And
I even found,
you can't do the same with somebody in the, in chemistry.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I think I understand the impulse behind writing that. And frankly, I understand why an editor who wants to get clicks would run with that title.
Mm-hmm. It's not just the title. I mean, it's a frame that sort of stretches out the whole piece.
And I am sort of the queen of extending metaphors far beyond their utility, and even I sort of balked at some of this. I mean, I also think, coming from my own experience, that in my own writing, which was not intended to be a viral piece, I anticipated about 25 people would read it. I talked about grief, and I have noticed quite a pushback that sort of the wrongness of usually framed as the wrongness of emotion in this discussion, but in fact what it is the wrongness of this emotion, that anger is a legitimate one. Grief is the feminine emotion of the person who is experiencing Stockholm Syndrome. Anger is the legitimate militant feeling to feel. And I think that's what's kind of the tricky part, that if you feel sad, it implies that any part of your experience was a thing to be missed.
Was valid, was useful, was worth keeping.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder, in that framework of it only anger and betrayal and no grief, and the push of sort of like, you should be willing to tear it all down, and what goes in its place? I mean, is it that the entire venture is wrong? I'm not sure. But I think the thing that made me uncomfortable with this framing was the implication that somehow once you're out of academia and deprogrammed, you'll go into a normal workforce where everybody's time is respected and everyone's work is considered valuable. And that's not real.
Yeah, I mean, how much of what's wrong with academia is just sort of what's wrong with modern capitalism
and people.
Yeah.
And institutions. So that's the thing, I think, that using cult language separates, implies that there's an important substantive difference in this space that is unlike other things. And also it's talking about behaviors, what is the threshold, essentially, for how many parts per million of sort of unbounded loyalty and all of these other things can you have in an organization, and that's normal before it becomes a cult.
Because, I mean, partly, it is academia that has cultivated this image as being above the fray, above it all, this sort of idyllic space that...
The life of the mind.
Right, which is, not even true for most people with tenure-track jobs, and that's not even most people with PhDs.
Yeah.
Though it may be true of most people who, are mentoring students in graduate programs.
Yes.
Right. I found as well-meaning as advisors are, it's like, you're at what used to, I guess, it used to be called a Research One institution. Mm-hmm. You know, most of your advisors are people who've only been at those kinds of places and really only know how to teach you how to function at those kinds of places. Mm-hmm. And I did, you know.
I mean, if anything, there's utility in considering other religious frameworks, like denominations that do a lot of missionary work, and the frustration experienced by missionaries in places that don't resemble anything like what their spiritual advisors understand or know, and that they then have to, figure out on the ground how to do this, or replicate those R1 practices and not gain a single convert.
That sort of, a missiology of. The sort of writing back the weird sort of anthropological view that academics can sort of take, but being like, oh, hey, none of these practices work here. That was all pretty useless. Thank you. Or demanding sort of, why aren't you producing these things in these places? And you're like, I can't. That's not a thing that I can do here. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I did. We're also gonna tie this in because we realized we were talking about this earlier, of how the sort of problem of exoticizing what's wrong with academia is similar in some ways to how people have been talking about, crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. I guess before we got into that, I wanted to ask you some about your own sort of experience or thoughts on anti-Catholicism, because I don't know, I feel like this is something that often isn't taken seriously, or even like thought that people don't necessarily acknowledge or believe in its existence anymore.
Yeah. When there was that year, like maybe 6 months ago, there was one of those sort of like, tweet this with your unpopular academic opinion, and everyone tweeted a thing that they knew actually lots of people believed, and I sort of said this was a problem, and holy hell, I got a lot of, well, it's only there because it should be there. This is a sort of bad thing. Or what was more problematic to me was sort of like, this is a lame, white, first world male problem, when I in fact think it is. Its role in the academy means it is very distinctly not those things. But it clearly made a lot of people very angry. So,
why do you think it made people angry?
I think
to claim that anti-Catholicism is a serious problem in the academy.
Because I think, and I don't in using this parallel intend to equate the severity of these two things. But I think we actually in the academy have an understanding that anti-Semitism isn't the same as I don't believe in this theology, or I disagree with the structure of a given group or denomination. It is a fear and hatred of an imagined religion and culture. Mm-hmm. And we can separate those two things. And in fact, the danger of it is that it is about a thing that doesn't exist. And that's where its power comes from. I think that there generally isn't an understanding that when we talk about anti-Catholicism, we are usually talking about the same thing. When I say anti-Catholicism is a problem, I don't mean people shouldn't be mean to the Pope, or people should be nicer to Catholics or believe in those beliefs. What I'm saying is that the Catholicism that gets talked about in the academy is not actually anything like what the thing is. And I will pull my well-read copy of Jenny Franchit's Road to Rome. She uses the term Romanism as the essentially imagined version of Catholicism that people are sort of upset with. And I think making sure that we're actually talking about the thing, not what we imagine the thing to be, is pretty important. In fact, imagining that it is that to talk about the Catholic Church is to talk about a white male experience is like basic level 1 failure to understand what the church is. And it's tied to a lot of other kind of misconceptions.
So if sort of the imagined, Judaism that is the target of anti-Semitic theories is, the elders of Zion and George Soros.
Blood libel and all that.
Then what is Romanism? What is because people may really think that it is Catholicism. So.
I mean, it is the thing that America isn't. I mean, it's the foil for so much of American Protestant identity that it's invisible. It is. I'm going to sound like the Spanish Inquisition sketch from Monty Python. It is sort of extreme hierarchy, loyalty to the Pope, lack of individual private conscience, essentially a unique sort of gender division and hierarchy that is unmatched and more extreme than any other group you would find. And then it's some of the things where it's more like the inability to grasp that the church is a living, evolving thing. And I'm not talking about dogma, I'm talking about practice. But knowing that like Vatican II happened, hearing, you just encounter weird things in conversation where you're like, oh, I don't know where you think that. Like that was gone with the Council of Trent or something. So an acknowledgement that like the Church of 1592 is not the same as the Church of 2018 in meaningful, practical ways.
What are things that people think are still true of the church today?
Well, I mean, I had a friend early in grad school who had gone to St. Olaf, and he had been raised Catholic in Connecticut. And he said he was not a practicing Catholic, and he was like, yet I found myself having to say, yes, Catholics are allowed to do this. Yes, I'm allowed to eat meat on Fridays. Like, no, I don't have, I don't have to do these sorts of, I mean, recently, a choral director of mine said something about like, oh, I don't think we hear the verse of that hymn because Catholics aren't allowed to sing the verses. They can only sing the chorus. And we were all like, what? This isn't Miserere Mei that Mozart is transcribing because no one's allowed to write it down. Like, this sense that everything is very, very ritualized and circumscribed, it is really all over the place. But then also not realizing things that have changed that are important, like when we talk about the sexual abuse crisis and we think about who and where and when, and we focus on the dominant presence of young boys in this historical problem. I was too old already to become an altar server when girls started being allowed to be altar servers in the Catholic Church. And there are plenty of other spaces in which young girls and women were victims in this situation, but have, the simple knowledge that like I would not have had the chance to be in this particular situation with a priest because I wasn't allowed to do that, that didn't exist really until the early to mid 90s. So little things like that. And I know that a lot of it may be because of the issue of, that I had plenty of older relatives and friends who had never been, as Catholics had never been allowed to step inside a Protestant church and that there is that separation. And that for better or worse, despite it being the largest denomination in the country, it is not the tacit established religion of the country. That is still Protestantism. Yeah,
I was really fascinated when I was reading Robert Orsi's book, History and Presence.
Yes.
Where he talks about how, and as you said, it sort of becomes invisible because it's sort of, it's like been, it's like we're looking at a mimeograph of a mimeograph of a mimeograph. Mm-hmm. Where any kind of religion is placed along this, the more Protestant it is, in other words, kind of individualist, believing in things being metaphorical than, actually really there, like, whether it's, communion or things like that. The more Protestant is, then that makes it a good religion. And the more kind of Catholic it is, less individualist, kind of more primitive,
but not the good kind of primitivism that we would want to go back, not the apostolic primitivism.
No, not like, yeah.
The metaphorical stuff is good when we're talking about it. That's good and Protestant when we're talking about the real presence of Christ, but not when we're talking about the Word.
Right.
So.
That's true. Yeah, the sort of the kind of idolatry of the Bible sort of goes against that a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the more Catholic it is, then it's bad, and you can see this in how scholars look at other religions in like the 19th, early 20th century, and really just sort of pop ideas of religion, so that Buddhism was seen as the Protestant analog, and Hinduism was the sort of Catholic analog with all.
Look at its icons and exactly.
And even the Academia's Occult article, it's very individualist, kind of middle finger of a cult, and so it's this Protestant ethos.
That I can decide for myself what it is, and I don't need your approval for my justification. I don't need the approval of any of these sorts of groups.
So these sort of tropes are just so baked into American culture, though, that it really is hard for us to see it, and especially, and even though Catholicism is the most, numerous denomination. I mean, it's, I grew up in suburban Memphis and knew very few Roman Catholics, and it was about as foreign to me as, Judaism.
Which is why I think when people talk about the Catholic vote, there is, the same way when we talk about, what did Catholics think about slavery? I'm thinking of that. Randall, I can't remember his last name, one of the editors of Catholics in the Old South. Catholics in the North thought one thing, and Catholics in the South, literally they thought the same thing as every other major Protestant denomination that managed to have a split. Catholicism thought the Vatican said something different about slavery than many Protestant denominations in America did. But it built in is the idea that, what you think about something is decided by a guy over there. I don't know if you know Pete Chaika, but a lot of his work is on the role of conscience, particularly kind of Catholic conscience arguments in the 20th century. I think most would assume there isn't a place, or isn't not just a dissenting place, but a legitimate place for conscience, which there is.
What do you mean by that?
That there in fact is sort of provision within church doctrine for issues of private conscience, and this is where I should have looked at Pete's stuff before we talked. But one of the things that I think made Catholicism or Romanism, I would say, so important for American. Essentially, this is the imagining of the American community involves imagining what you're not, and why are we concerned about letting Catholics vote? Because we're not sure that they're using their own independent mind. They're just doing what their priest sort of tells them. One of my contentions that, in fact, there was less concern over, I studied converts in the 19th century, that there was less concern over women converting, because who cares? They don't get to vote or say anything, do anything useful anyway. As long as they don't become a nun, that's fine. The woman I study, whether or not the Pope would have agreed with it, and I don't know if he did, but I know she knew him, is perfectly fine saying, I think the church's position on slavery is wrong. That doesn't change when she converts. I'm growing up Unitarian. And I think that one of the problems that in some ways the foil of Catholicism allows American Protestant culture to perhaps inflate or to put a little more shine on the things that are considered Protestant virtues by virtue of they're not Catholic. Catholics do these things. They are they are like sheep, that, you know, in the bad way, not the good way.
Right.
And all of those sorts of things.
Not fluffy and cute, but.
And, or, you know, the flock of the Lord. And then on the other hand, well, nothing that Protestants do is like that, because that's not what Protestants are like. And whatever Catholics do is like that, because that's what Catholics are like. And it means that as someone who went to a history program for grad school, that I did not get a degree in church history or Catholic history or really anything rooted in religious history. I was a historian of 19th century America, largely antebellum America, largely the history of women. So I didn't come out of a place where anyone had really any knowledge of Catholicism other than sort of maybe earlier European modes, which meant that I, from incredibly brilliant scholars, heard some of the dumbest takes on why someone would have converted or what it meant to be Catholic, including the wonderful intersection of misogyny and anti-Catholicism of maybe she just converted because she was like 30 and hadn't gotten married yet and was lonely, and she was like looking for an authority figure in her life.
Yeah.
You know. So,
like,
well, whatever agency you think she had, you've just taken it away from her. Yeah.
Well, and I know you've said elsewhere, you know, this sort of curious sort of thinking of even studying Catholicism as like a niche.
Yeah.
Right. Even though it's the largest denomination, it'll be seen as
framed as niche. Yeah.
Right. Even compared to studying, you know, like some little
Cumberland Presbyterians.
Right. Isn't considered as, yeah.
Well, and I think this is a case in which I think we see it in, take your average Western Civ class.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, every time you give a test, I always had students say, Catholics believed in justification by faith alone, and Protestants believed in justification by good works. And their argument was, Catholicism is an authoritarian religion. Protestantism is an individual one, so of course it would believe that you could do something. And then, you know, basically the argument goes, Martin Luther said everyone could read the Bible, and everyone read the Bible, and then they learned it was crap, and nobody believed in religion ever again. And I've seen lots of faculty get upset about that, and I'm like, literally, when did you ever talk about religion again after the Reformation and maybe the French Revolution? We don't talk about its existence. The same way we don't talk about Catholicism or Judaism or any other non-Protestant religion outside of the moments when it's very clear that they're weird outsiders. And I think they, in some ways, historians of Catholicism could learn a lot, are sometimes quite insular themselves, which is another problem. They face the same problem that historians of women face, which is, how does including women change the narrative? Because if you can't make an argument as to how it changes the narrative of U.S. history in an important way, why should you be anything other than the little colored bar at the side of the textbook page? And so, I mean, maybe the argument is it doesn't, you know, that Catholicism as a large denomination doesn't change anything about American culture. That is also a remarkable point that should be kind of interrogated. But it's all nobody thinks any of this is sort of worth anything other than maybe as a thought experiment.
Where do you lean on this question of whether it changes the U.S. narrative or whether maybe it doesn't, but that's still important?
I mean, I think we would actually want to unpack the fact that, I mean, I've seen people talking recently about, like, how is so much of the Supreme Court Catholic and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, I think the reason we don't talk about why it doesn't impact culture would be then we would be forced to acknowledge that American culture isn't secular, or wasn't secular for a long time. And I think anyone who studies 18th and 19th century U.S. history knows the sort of importance of Catholicism as this sort of boogeyman way to sort of define what is different about America and American culture. And I mean, I think it's also kind of, notable, or would be useful maybe to think about how culture was changed. I had a wonderful conversation once with a priest who was very keen on the idea that, it was removing prayer and Bible from schools, that blah, blah, blah. He was really upset about Abington v. Shemp and all of that. And I asked him if he knew who some of the sort of earliest supporters were of removing Bible reading from schools. And so we talked about Archbishop Hughes, and we sort of talked about whose Bible and whose prayers get read.
Because it was Catholics
who were essentially like, either our kids don't have to say these prayers and read this part of the Bible, or they're gonna go to other schools.
Because public schools at the time, right? They were non-sectarian, by which it meant it could be any kind of Protestantism was taught there, right?
And I find it a useful analog to the way, Catholicism has become absorbed in a certain sense into the realm of kind of normal American religions, large quotes around all of these, where it becomes, it's somehow non-sectarian or even non-establishment to locate things there. They don't, when they say in God we trust, they don't mean any particular God. And my response is sort of like, then why doesn't it say in Allah we trust? If it's any God, why use that term? Why even use the vowel in the middle? So I think all of these are really important questions that could be asked. But the fact that there's a tacit understanding that Catholicism isn't really inflecting American culture is enough of an argument for why it's niche. Studying Catholics and women together makes it even more niche, with the understanding being that, like, what impact could this have actually had on American culture? All of which comes from a place of often not knowing anything about the religion as currently constituted or its historical place in the U.S. It was just, we know that's not America.
Right. And America was where civilization was going to be purified of, papistry, which was tied up with tyranny. And
that at worst it's a drag on American civilization. At best, it's sort of learned to smarten itself up a bit. And become a Protestant enough to pass. Yeah, and therefore also clearly shows that it's full of crap, because it's supposed to be the same everywhere, isn't it? And which is, of course, not realistic or true in any way. You create this sort of ahistorical monolithic idea of what Catholicism is, which wasn't even true in Europe. Yep. And then you can say, look, you diverted from that, so it was all, a lie. Yeah, so you don't even really believe the things that you say. It's very much sort of setting up a false set of beliefs, which then you can sort of be like, and they're a bunch of hypocrites because they don't even believe in this. Or, more problematically, that diversity of opinion itself indicates inherent instability or failure within the church. Because if you had that diversity in a Protestant church, they would just start their own denomination. And that was my understanding growing up. Not so much here where there aren't as many churches, but my mother's parents lived in Georgia and then in North Carolina growing up. And that was how it was explained to me why there were multiple Baptist churches in a town. Is that, when a bunch of people within the congregation disagreed, they would start their own church. Or that when, in Catholicism, you don't get to pick your own priest. You get whoever comes down the line. I will say, you send the wrong one out to a parish and they can make sure that priest gets removed for a lot of reasons. But, that so much of this is kind of baked in and uninterrogated. But we want to acknowledge that sort of who has the power to sort of say the way things are, is sort of bent in one direction. And I think I'd be interested in sort of having people who teach U.S. history. I am as guilty of it as anyone. Consider how and when they talk about non-dominant religion in their classes. What impression does that give to students? Do they stop talking about religion at a certain point? Are they essentially replicating arguments about modernization and secularization that then lead us to a place where we are not capable of analyzing what is actually happening in the world around us, because we imagine ourselves at the end of trajectories that weren't real.
People imagine, and this is probably a regional thing as well, because I don't know that my students would necessarily think along these lines, but you have students who sort of think, well, thanks to Martin Luther, sort of, it's almost like the sort of glasnost narrative that Luther kind of opened the door to, and that finally led in this sort of post-religious age. But then sort of, well, what do you do with all the people, the religious people still around you? How do you, especially if a growing percentage of them are people of color, what do you do with that?
Well, and thinking about regional cultures of, my students here in New England would generally underestimate the number of people who are believers, not because they're unaware, but because it is not a thing that is considered something that you talk about. And there may be lots of historic reasons for that. It may be because of notable religious diversity or whatever, but that it is, you knew the kids maybe that went to your church, and maybe you knew where everybody else went if they did. But it wasn't a thing that would get asked. I mean, this is sort of, you hear from scholars who get jobs and move to certain locations and are aware of the fact that their realtor is going to ask them what church they're going to go to. And then there are, of course, places like Baylor where you do have to say what church you go to. So a lot of this might be regionally different. That being said, nobody at my university, they didn't all come from Connecticut originally. They had come from lots of places. So, and I think it was frustrating to me as a scholar, because I often felt that I not just needed to justify the need or the worth of my project, but the worth of the question itself was not a given. That simply existing as a thing was enough to make some topics worth studying, but not everything. And that is not unique to studying a non-dominant religion. That's something that everybody in a lot of different covering a lot of topics have to deal with. And I think this one, because it's understood to be the visible figures in the church are all men and are almost all white men. To say that sort of this is a white male question is to further erase the fact that we're actually mostly talking about women and people of color much of the time. And replicate some really old, terrible theories of religion, deprivation theory and stuff like this from 50 years ago about, well, these are people with crappy lives, and therefore they pick this really on-the-nose, regimented religion that promises them everything. And
I admit, I'll hear people who are sort of secular liberals, and the way that they talk sort of patronizingly about, religious Black people and religious Latino people, and sort of kind of give them like a pass, like it's okay for them to be religious because they're minorities. It's always rubbed me the wrong way, and I don't know that I could put a finger on it, give you a specific example, but it is something that I've sensed a lot.
I mean, it's I'm going to cite him again because he was very useful in my doctoral work. Sean McLeod has written another book, which I love, called Divine Hierarchies, which actually looks at the role of ideas of race and eugenics in the creation of the field of religious studies, and the way that it informs a lot of the ideas that became a part of it. He mostly talks about race and eugenics. I, in my own work, have tried to extend it to talking about gender. Essentially, how do we explain this Unitarian becoming a Catholic, going from a rational religion to an irrational religion? But if she's a woman, she's already irrational, so it makes more sense, and she could easily fall under the thrall of a priest. But he really maps a lot of this onto ideas that are sort of central to colonialism. That women became Catholic in the 19th century because they liked smells and bells is pretty close to, who has sedate, sober, rational religions and who has wild, loud religions and lots of music and all this other sort of stuff.
You see people tweet, like white people tweeting gifs of black people, sort of in what looks like a gif of someone in a sort of charismatic worship service, is something that you see too often to make me comfortable,
But it's never white people in those situations who are members of holiness movement churches all over the place. That, I'm always sort of emphasizing that, like, just because the churches aren't around now, there were a lot of, New England was the hotbed of Baptist, evangelical religion for a long time. So, I think all of these things are often tangled up together, but that the public face of the church being all male and all white makes it kind of complex and can, provoke the response of, well, what does it matter if I am anti-Catholic? It's okay to hate the Pope. And I'm like, that's not what anti-Catholicism is in this situation. And also the fact that you primarily think it's the Pope is sort of part of the problem, that informs the way you think about scholarship in an important way. Yeah.
Well, I was curious how you've noticed these trends coming into play lately, given, sort of the recent revelations about sex abuse crisis. It seems like there's been a bit of an uptick recently.
I think the Pennsylvania report was big.
And now the McCarrick imbroglio, which I don't fully understand. I'm not going to ask you.
At least you admit it. Neither do I. It's almost like you need real specialized knowledge to understand these things.
A lot of people have been eager to pretend like they didn't just look the stuff up on Wikipedia, yesterday.
Yeah.
But how do you notice these kind of habits of thinking, coming into play, the way people think and talk about this?
One, it may also just be the general kind of hot take environment of our media landscape. I actually noticed this years ago when the Pope came to the U.S. And Father James Martin, who many people will know, sort of tweeted about the failure of a reporter for something big like the AP or, a very big wire service or the like, to use any of the correct terminology to describe anything that happened. Mm-hmm. And the reporter was like, I don't think you can expect us to use like this niche language. And as a Catholic, you have to get trained out of calling everything mass. But it was this sort of like, why do I have to learn your weird words for things? Like, isn't a minister the same as, and isn't a sermon was one of the ones where it was just really kind of jarring. It was, again, the sort of anthropological view of this happening. That kind of like, whatever, just our words are fine why do you have to have these weird words for things? And so it's there in the sort of more comical sense. And I think it's there now that you don't really need to know very much about Catholicism to be able to explain this, because it is essentially, well, don't we already know everything we need to know about it to have a response to it? And it's both the sort of, well, we can explain this because the church hierarchy, blah, 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 but then also a dismissal of, like, we need to actually really understand clericalism and these sorts of problems. I mean, it's really difficult, and I will say, you know, some of this is a preview of a session I hope to be a part of at the AHA if it gets accepted. You know, that at the same time the Pennsylvania report came out, the private school near where I grew up came out with a report about a number of faculty members who were allowed to essentially actually assault young girls for decades. The Ronell thing at NYU happened. And then I found out one of the professors I was closest to in college had been sexually assaulting friends of mine, male friends. So all of this kind of came down on me at the same time. And I think where I see this connecting to our previous conversation about academia as a cult is that to exoticize a religion seems often to function to sort of say anything that happens there is not just Catholic inflected, but is solely because of Catholicism. And it means that we don't, you know, that the important other lenses and other modes of analysis often get abandoned because everything is filtered through one lens. And I think Orsi talks in his piece about in a Catholic way that meant lots of things, that it meant for victims it became very tied to Catholic spaces and practices, but that also it was linked to the practical workings of the church and to the sort of theology and culture of the church. And that the problem we have when a lot of kind of the response and analysis comes from people who don't necessarily have a deep understanding of everything, is that we're not really able to talk about, we actually can't analyze how this happened in a Catholic way, because if we assume that's all it is, every explanation becomes the Catholic way. You know, if all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And by failing to maybe put this in conversation with other things, it's not to say that there aren't, that some of this didn't happen because of particular aspects of Catholic culture or Catholic institutionalism, but that is Catholic institutionalism somehow different from the way it functions in lots of other American spaces, or are we talking about where it is on a spectrum? You know, how many of those practices can you have in a workplace before it becomes a cult? Right. And so I think that often people who study Catholic history don't necessarily have the grounding in lots of other areas that might give them the tools to analyze and talk about this stuff.
So what would be,
you know, that we actually didn't have, you hear a lot of why would anyone let their children be Catholic? You actually, and I mean in a very broad way from people who are disconnected, you actually haven't heard the same thing about why would anyone let their daughter do gymnastics? You know, that when something is understood as being solely constituted out of this one culture, it's very easy to sort of say the whole thing is bad and write off anyone who chooses to change it, especially if you don't think of it as a place that changes.
Right. So no one would assume that the Larry Nassar scandals, you know, is synonymous with gymnastics.
Yeah, that in some ways that would force you to actually acknowledge what some of the problems are problems around institutions and power and often also patriarchy. You know, I had a student last semester who was inspired by, you know, for him the Nassar scandal was the one that stuck out in his mind, not the Catholic Church one, and he wanted to know, why did institutions cover this up? And so he looked at the first Title IX case which was in the very late 70s. And it was Yale. I think it was a grad student and an advisor. And we had, we hypothesized all these things that might be the case. Once you've covered one up, you have to cover the rest up, blah, blah, blah. And he was really disturbed when he was like, no, they just didn't think sexual harassment was a bad thing. And they didn't care. And that was a totally different explanation than we had thought about. And I think that what I often see in analysis is not that everyone gives the argument they already had, but people have already kind of closed off a lot of analytical pathways. The number of times I had to deal with really brilliant scholars saying, isn't this because priests are made to be celibate? And the number one response would be, then why does this happen in other places that don't have that requirement? The number two response is, so essentially there is sort of unbridled male sexual energy, and if just women of age would allow themselves to be victimized, that would be the solution to this kind of thing. But that argument was assuming that the answer to this was not just inherently Catholic, but was inherently and only Catholic. It was something particular about the church that made this happen. And if you said, oh, but there are lots of other, how can we compare these other things? Well, those ones are different because they're not Catholic. It becomes sort of tautological.
I think it is hard, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think it'd be hard to see what's wrong in the Catholic Church as things that are just kind of wrong with how institutions work, because our cultural understanding of what's bad about institutions
is informed
by this Romanism, right? That we have for centuries grafted on the more Romanist, more Catholic it is, that's a bad institutionalism, and that's the opposite of individualism. So to separate that. And
that institutions that are full of individuals are somehow that there's a point at which an institution becomes, it passes this cult threshold or this authoritarian threshold. The fact that Catholicism is obviously transnational, something that despite it being in vogue when I was doing my degree, it took me nearly to the end of my degree to realize I was doing something transnational because the Catholic Church was not allowed to be included in that conversation. I think for Americans in particular, it's like, well, we don't have any control over that institution, as though we have control over the other institutions in our lives. But our institutions are full of free thinkers, as opposed to that institution, which is full of sheeple.
Right.
Sorry, go
ahead.
No, just sort of thinking about, and I think one thing that might be a problem is that it allows sexual abuse and assault issues in other denominations to become, to use a phrase from a friend of mine who studied Abu Ghraib, it's just a bad apple. Who gets to be an individual bad apple and who's systemic, even if that individual bad apple has moved through a system and been allowed to move through a system. Well, because it's not a top-down hierarchy, so.
It's not a top-down hierarchy, so there's less of a paper trail.
Yeah, so it's not really anyone's fault here. It sort of diffuses responsibility.
But, I just know anecdotally, that there's plenty of abuse of children going on in Protestant churches. But yeah, there's no way that you'd be able to have the same kind of paper trail that you would, going through a diocesan archive. I'm not trying to say that word out loud.
Diocesan, yeah.
Diocesan. There's no place to do that if you're dealing with Baptist churches. And so and so that gives the idea that the problem isn't systemic or Well,
and I think I had the naive thought that years ago that, I remember thinking, really, I think when the Boston stuff was very much in the news, thinking that but this is a sort of thing that happens in educational spaces and in youth group spaces and in all kinds of spaces. And I thought that, not in a hopeful sense, but I was like, there will undoubtedly be other revelations we find about these happening in other places. And I didn't anticipate, USA gymnastics. But then I was like, oh, well, maybe those will help us sort of maybe shift the narrative, that we can see that this is actually about institutions and protecting people in power, and that maybe Catholicism has, I don't know, since it's had 2,000 years to do it, come up with the best possible, most refined system for making sure that powerful people never pay for it. I think the American political system is kind of running a close second. We're doing a good job there too.
Yeah.
And I thought that somehow maybe this happening in other spaces would prompt seeing similarities, and it largely hasn't. But I think that that's the same problem with the academia as a cult thing. Again, like, how much of this is a cult and how much of this is culture, and noting that things that happen in the Catholic Church in America, Catholics in America are Americans, and they know American culture and American beliefs, and they would go to American police officers who are no more likely to believe you if you were coming from a Catholic space than from a Protestant space, in all of these sorts of places. In particular, to hear the idea that somehow Catholics are particularly notably bad at believing victims of sexual assault, that strikes me as problematic.
That's interesting. And we'll probably wrap up with this, but it's interesting you talking about the sex abuse problem being, like, emphasizing how American, the problem is. Because I know that often sort of reactionaries, people who, Catholic reactionaries who, oppose Vatican II, they don't like Pope Francis. I think this is part of what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, for them, it means that, this just shows what happens when you have this sort of, libertine culture. And it kind of, latches on this homophobic stuff. And
it's very much tied into the place of Americanism, and modernism and liberalism is all kind of one package, which is sort of slightly after the stuff that I study, but it's definitely there. And I think that, and those people have, I think, in a really disgusting way, basically weaponized the suffering of people, particularly young boys, to sort of, it's this horrible intersection of misogyny and homophobia that can at times erase female victims, but sort of ties into this issue of, well, we know that this is bad because there's no possible way the 17-year-old boy would have wanted the attentions of a man. 17-year-old girl, we might analyze a little differently, but that this has really been used to sort of carry out a crusade against gay priests in the ministry, and I think that's a pretty horrendous thing, and I don't think it should be. And I've heard it humored by scholars who don't really know anything about what they're talking about.
What does that look like when they humor it?
Well, it's very much in the same kind of like, it's in the same vein of, well, wouldn't this stop if we got rid of celibacy? Failing to understand the difference between sexual attraction and the tendency to abuse and power, that somehow these things are merely, it's kind of the older sort of 17th century understanding of there's just this spectrum of sexual energy and it has to go somewhere. And that basically the implication being all men would be rapists if they weren't given the appropriate outlets and opportunities. And I think the implication, that you'll hear scholars who think that they're being really liberated in thinking like, oh, if we just got rid of celibacy, or if priests, both didn't have to be celibate and could be openly gay, this would be fine. The implication being all gay men are pedophiles if not given the appropriate outlet. And it blows my mind that really, really smart people cannot make that connection in their head. That this isn't just about sort of diverted sex, or maybe they are making the argument this is just about diverted sexual energy, that essentially everyone or every man has it in them to be a pedophile and a rapist if other people don't give him the outlet that he deserves or that he needs biologically. I don't think that they would say they're making that argument, but it's kind of the only logical conclusion.
Well, I guess, when I read this years ago, I thought, this is interesting. I found it persuasive at the time, though it was actually Andrew Sullivan who argued this, and this was a few years ago, arguing that having this celibate priesthood will disproportionately attract closeted gay men who then are, and I think he argued it wasn't that, of course, he himself being gay, he wasn't arguing that, that there is a sort of inherent connection between, homosexuality and pedophilia, but that rather you ended up with people who were emotionally stunted and would be attracted to someone who was of the similar sort of kind of emotional maturity, like relationship maturity as you, so that it's sort of like a prolonged adolescence.
That's a big old leap.
Yeah, I think
it's notable that argument would be made when I think we generally, one of the things that we struggle with as a culture and as people in academia is struggle with understanding why pedophilia exists and how to grapple with it as its own separate thing. I think one thing that doesn't really get sort of talked about is that there are men who have kind of what we would consider more consensual affairs with women, who have not terribly consensual affairs with women who are of the age of majority. And there are men who leave the priesthood. I just picked up a copy of Seven Story Mountain. Thomas Merton struggles with some of this. I've wondered about my friend Isaac Hecker here, who has sort of some very clearly very invested emotional relationships with women.
So you're not sure that you buy this idea that like these people
I don't buy it.
I
mostly don't buy it because I don't think is that the argument we make for why pedophilia exists everywhere else, or are we looking for an argument that can help us explain? We've drawn a circle around what we think are the causal factors, and we're trying to kludge together something from that. And I think the same way I would sort of say, like, don't analyze academia outside of its larger context. I think we have very specific ideas of what is and isn't the appropriate context for studying something like the Catholic sexual abuse crisis, and that we often, as a culture, will exclude any context that would tie us to this thing. That if this is anything about how the American legal system treats people who report this, we don't want to touch that, because then it becomes not a separate thing. It becomes something we have to analyze. And that's why I think the cult language is useful to people, because it makes it a thing that I am separate from. I'm in the normal part. If this had happened in an institution made up of people like me, it never would have happened, because we're normal, not like those weirdos.
Right. It sort of reminds me of, I'll see it on Facebook where kind of mainline Protestants will sort of tell, why don't you just become Episcopalian?
Yep. Oh, right? Episcopalians, they're Catholics, but with better music.
Right. Why don't you just, so that way we can sort of distance ourselves from it and make sure that it's not an issue that we, have anything to do with ourselves.
As though the Episcopal Church and the Worldwide Anglican Communion don't have any massive disagreements over these sorts of issues. I think that becomes the thing. Another thing that anti-Catholicism, in the sense that I mean it, becomes a problem for analysis, because it leads to, why don't you just leave? Why would you stay and fix this thing? And that actually may or may not be a place where Catholic culture is useful. Going back to our issue of who leaves and makes a new church, that both Catholicism allows for sort of a lot of diversity of local practice and lots of other things it always has, but that there's the Reformation, and on the other side, there isn't just the church going, we're not changing anything ever. That for better or worse, there are mechanisms for change, and that's a pretty consistent thing within the church. But I think you could easily turn that back on people and ask them about the institutions and the cultures that they love if they found out something terrible was going on within.
Right.
In fact, one of their responses would be, it's not the culture, it's these people. It's something that happened. It's not this thing that I'm a part of. And if they moved beyond that, is it wrong to want to fix a thing? And I guess this is where that cult language happens as well. Are the problems built in to an extent that they can't be excised? Or can those people within it of good faith do something about this system? And I think it's easy if you conceptualize yourself as outside of the system, it's easy to sort of say these people are fools or naive for thinking that they can fix this. The best choice is to basically burn it down. I think that we have seen, as this has cropped up in other places, that's a really easy argument to make when it's not your house you have to burn down.
Yeah.
To sort of exterminate the plague. So I just think it would be perhaps useful maybe to consider the ways that we do and don't teach about the history of Catholicism and frankly religion in general in the academy. That maybe if you've literally never read a book on the history of Catholicism and all you did was grow up in America, maybe you don't actually know enough to give, advice. Like, it's okay to just listen to people who know more than you. And I don't even count myself as a person who does. I'm just a person who knows who maybe we should be listening to instead. It's okay to listen to other people on this.
Well, we've probably taken up folks' time, but I did want to give the opportunity if you had to recommend books, films, websites, something that would, for someone who doesn't know much.
I'll see if I can find it and maybe you can link to it.
Sure.
A historian on Twitter, I think she actually wrote it up as a post somewhere, sort of wrote about the difficulty of who was from, who's not a member of the church anymore, but was from one of these places in Pennsylvania, writing about how difficult it is to leave, or to just throw this all away because of all of the good things that are related. I do have a couple of other articles that I can suggest about the way the American church has, the way essentially American Protestant culture inflected church governance and these ideas of maybe lay control. That being said, I'm not sure the laity are going to be any better at fixing this because it's not like no lay person knew about these things. So there are a couple articles that I can give you links to. I mean, I think also reading in magazines like Commonweal and America, which is the Jesuit magazine, there's often really good nuanced coverage in places like that.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, great.
Cool.
Thank you. And people can follow you at Erin, ERIN _ Bartram, BARTRAM. And folks can follow me at William R. Black. And thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.
All righty.